Zheng He, a Chinese Muslim admiral, departs from Suzhou with a fleet of 317 ships and 28,000 crewmen, regarded as the greatest naval expedition in human history up to that point, to expand Chinese influence over the uncivilized world, in a campaign that would later be known as the Ming Treasure Voyages. The largest of the massive treasure ships were estimated to have been 120 meters or 390 feet long, significantly dwarfing even the second largest contemporary vessels of the Venice Navy. Don't get it twisted though, Zheng He's fleet was unprecedented, but the routes he followed were not. He utilized long-established, well-mapped trade routes between China, Southeast Asia, and the Arabian Peninsula that had been used since at least the Han Dynasty a millennium and a half earlier. One notable example is during the Three Kingdoms period, when the King of Wu sent a 20-year diplomatic mission along the Southeast Asia coastline and reached as far as the Eastern Roman Empire. Travel went in both directions north and south, as Malay sailors were known within Chinese seaports as far back as the 3rd century BC. So common were these encounters on the high seas that the Chinese had a name for these Southeast Austronesian-style ships, Kunlunbo. A testament to China's long-existing presence in the region were the Chinese port colonies Zheng would encounter throughout Southeast Asia, even as far south as the islands of Borneo and Java. A translator within Zheng's crew, Ma Huan, in 1416 AD, gives detailed accounts of his observations of these migrants, referring to the expatriate Chinese as Tang people, in reference to the Tang dynasty, which many southern Chinese attribute their lineage to. There is perhaps a significance to this name that we will touch more on later. To unexpectedly encounter your fellow countrymen so far from home, at the edge of the known world, must have been a surreal feeling.
What are you doing here? And not in a racist way.
This phenomenon of an ancient Chinese coastal diaspora that expanded navally could be perceived akin to that of the Hellenization of the Mediterranean by the early Greeks. While Zheng's expeditions would stretch as far as India, the Arabian Peninsula, and Africa, the longest lasting effects of the campaigns would persist in Southeast Asia, through friendly ambassadorial relations, naval intimidation, and even full-scale military invasions. Zheng and his men expanded Chinese trade relations with many kingdoms throughout Southeast Asia. Previously only described in whispers by small-scale southern Chinese merchants and explorers, a giant world that had previously been shrouded in mystery to the general Chinese population was illuminated. So influential were Zheng's voyages, monuments to him that still exist today are scattered throughout Southeast Asia and even South Asia, most notably in Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka, honoring the significance of his visits. However, it's important to note that the beginning of Chinese migration southward can't really be traced to a specific starting point in time. It has been an ongoing process that has been built into the foundation of the Chinese story from a time immemorial, before there was even the concept of China. To better understand this, we need to look back at China's origins and its development as a single nation and ethnic identity. Before there was even the concept of being Han Chinese, the dominant ethnic group representing over 90% of China's population today, there was a proto-Chinese identity known as Tianxia, translated to all under heaven. This ideology embodies a worldview that conceptualizes all under heaven as a single unified system under the moral order of those set by the people of the early Yellow River civilizations. Developed during the Zhou dynasty, the foundational doctrine of the ideology is the mandate of heaven, which enforces the divine right of rule over all that is under heaven by the king of Zhou. By default, this meant that it was the destiny of the people of the Yellow River Basin to subjugate and civilize all people on earth. A strict middle-out hierarchy was developed, beginning with the king at the center of the civilized world, surrounded by his subjects, surrounded by tributaries, and finally encircled by barbarians, who would all inevitably succumb to the will of the mandate of heaven. A surviving hint of this ideology exists in China's endonym today, Zhongguo, or Middle Kingdom, exemplifying China's historical belief that its civilization existed at the center of the world.
To them the heavens are round but the earth is flat and square, and they firmly believe that their empire is right in the middle of it. They do not like the idea of our geographies pushing their China into the corner of the Orient. The geographer was therefore obliged to change his design, and by omitting the first meridian of the Fortunate Islands, he left a margin on either side of the map, making the kingdom of China appear right in the center. This was more in keeping with their ideas, and it gave them a great deal of pleasure and satisfaction.
It is during the Qin dynasty that the modern concept of China matures into its proto-form, in which its people establish a true empire under the leadership of the nation's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. Modern-day southern China begins being colonized and assimilated, as 500,000 imperial soldiers are dispatched to civilize the barbarians of the south. The indigenous populations of what would become southern China are known to the Chinese as Baiyue, groups of various Austroasiatic speaking populations that share similar material culture and genetic heritage with much of Southeast Asia's populations. Check out my Baiyue video in the description below. So the migration of Chinese people into non-Chinese barbarian lands is nothing new to the Chinese. It's a millennia-long phenomenon that has existed in Imperial China's history since its foundation. Two excellent examples of China's early success in colonizing regions that share parallel culture and heritage with Southeast Asia are the southern islands of Hainan and Taiwan, which are both today over 90% Han Chinese, despite both once being inhabited exclusively by Kra-Dai and Austroasiatic populations. This expansion of Chinese influence southbound would set the stage for Chinese migration into Southeast Asia, as a Chinese presence now existed right at the region's doorstep. Now this is a hot and controversial take, but while modern territorial boundaries and international law will likely limit the military expansion of China and deter the displacement of indigenous populations, if we trace back all of Chinese history and its perpetual expansion outwards, particularly southbound, one could argue that the Sinification of Southeast Asia is today still an ongoing process that has yet to be completed. With virtually every country possessing mixed Chinese and indigenous culture and heritage, Southeast Asia could be perceived as a region in a transitional stage that is a frontier land for the Chinese, similar to that of Baiyue, Hainan, and Taiwan in ancient times, which now have all been nearly completely Sinicized, despite once being inhabited exclusively by cultures similar to that of modern-day Southeast Asians and Pacific Islanders. It's during this era that modern-day Vietnam is the first nation in Southeast Asia to receive significant numbers of Chinese migrants. While celebrating much of its own indigenous culture, Vietnam is the most Chinese-like of all Southeast Asian cultures, and was heavily influenced by China under the Sinosphere, sharing overlapping culture and genetic heritage. Some notable attributes are the practicing of Confucian values, the use of Chinese writing up until French colonization, and even the use of chopsticks, which is not universally shared throughout the rest of Southeast Asia. Vietnam is also unique in its relationship with China, in being the only Southeast Asian nation to have been directly ruled by China, with a significant Chinese military presence in the region that spanned for centuries. Because of how intertwined the histories were of these two nations, it's difficult to determine exactly the percentage of Vietnam's population that is of Chinese descent, though some estimates would put it at 20% or more, especially in the northern half of the country, which was ruled more consistently by China throughout the centuries. We may perhaps never know what the true figures are, as after the ascension of the Vietnamese Communist Party, strong anti-Chinese sentiment led to the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Chinese, with many that stayed disguising or altogether abandoning their Chinese identities to avoid persecution, despite many having centuries-long ancestral roots in Vietnam. So while other countries like Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia have on paper larger Chinese populations, it could be argued that in reality, the census data does not accurately reflect the true number of people with Chinese ancestry due to Vietnam's history of successful Chinese-Viet assimilation over the millennia, where today, many people of Chinese descent no longer identify as Chinese at all. These Chinese immigrants are known locally as Noi Hoa, and have had a significant presence in Vietnam since the 2nd century BC. They played a pivotal role in shaping Vietnam's history, often operating as the ruling oligarchy, Even during French colonization, Chinese merchants and businessmen were often favored over local Viet populations by the ruling French class. Formal diplomatic relations developed between the Tang dynasty and modern-day Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. This chain of islands in Southeast Asia was part of a maritime Silk Road that connected Southeast Asia to the rest of Eurasia, much of which by way of China. The Tang court records regularly receiving emissaries and tribute from the Filipino Datus, a chieftain ruling class throughout the Philippine Islands. Zheng Guoxi, a Tang dynasty officer, was the first ever recorded person of Chinese descent to be buried in the Philippines in 661 AD, after dying from disease during a naval campaign against Chinese pirates that were disrupting maritime trade in the region. Malay and Indonesian Quinlan sailors were reported to regularly berth at the ports of the Red River Delta in Vietnam, then under Tang China control. It's noteworthy that during this era, the Chinese presence in the Malay and Philippine archipelagos largely consisted of independent Chinese explorers and traders that were not necessarily financed by the imperial government. This meant that the voyages made into the island chains went relatively undocumented. Nonetheless, there is clear evidence of a significant Chinese presence in the region. Recent dive teams have discovered several Tang-era shipwrecks off the coast of Indonesia, the most famous of which is the Belitung shipwreck, which carried a large quantity of invaluable Chinese artifacts. During this time period, we also see the spread of Chinese-style Buddhism throughout the archipelagos, hinting that many of the Chinese sailors, in conjunction with bringing commodities of trade, also brought with them Chinese ideologies and religion. Archaeologists in recent decades have discovered an influx of Chinese ceramics, coins, and bronze mirrors during this era throughout Indonesia and Malaysia. To what extent these Chinese merchants set up permanent settlements is highly up for debate, but it's without a doubt that it was during the Tang dynasty that a truly significant and influential Chinese presence was established throughout Southeast Asia. And it's likely not a coincidence that Zheng He and his men centuries later would refer to the Chinese they encountered throughout the archipelagos as Tang people, perhaps insinuating that they were the descendants of those that had departed China during the Tang era, 6 dynasties earlier. While Vietnam was the only country in Indochina to be successfully colonized by ancient China, by the Middle Ages, the interiors of mainland Southeast Asia began falling directly under the influence of China. Ayutthaya, in present-day Thailand, began recording the arrival of Chinese merchants in the 12th century. These migrants were involved in the construction of the major temple Wat Ratchaburana, and left several Chinese inscriptions and cultural objects within the temple's crypt, including the inscription of several Chinese family names. The Chinese traders that remained permanently within the region would go on to dominate much of the local economies and political systems. Kings Taksin of Thonburi and Rama I were both part Chinese and encouraged further Chinese immigration. Today, Thailand is home to the largest overseas Chinese community in the world, accounting for nearly 15% of the nation's population. Perhaps most famously, Thailand's national dish, Pad Thai, is linguistically and historically derived from the Teochew Chow dish, Gyu Dao. The only first-hand account of the prehistoric civilization of Angkor in modern-day Cambodia was A Record of Cambodia, the Land and Its People, written by Chinese envoy Zhou Daguan, who visited the kingdom between 1296 to 1297 AD. To this day, Zhou's description of the royal palace, sacred buildings, women, traders, slaves, hill people, animals, landscapes, and everyday life remains our only window into a portrait of 13th century Cambodia, at a time when its splendors were still intact. It's worth noting that the vast majority of these Chinese migrants in Southeast Asia are comprised of just a few sub-ethnic groups: the Hakkas, Hokkien, Cantonese, Teochew, and Yunannese. Those from Fujian province were most commonly traders, while those from Canton province were more commonly artisans and laborers. Because of this, many Mingnan migrants from Fujian, or more northern provinces, who are more commonly merchants, would often migrate with their families or spouses, while the southern Cantonese would often arrive as single males, who would more often seek local women to marry, making them more prone to mix with the indigenous populations, where more northern Chinese groups were less likely to integrate. It's worth mentioning that while China was playing an immeasurable role in influencing Southeast Asia up through this point, so was India. Indian-style Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, and a wide range of traditions entered into Southeast Asia by way of Indian traders and explorers, beginning from at least the 3rd century BC. The region was essentially a maritime crossroads, nurturing a fantastic melting pot of indigenous, Indian, and Chinese cultures. Under the rule of Genghis Khan and his descendants, the Mongols created the largest contiguous empire in all of human history, connecting nearly every corner of the known world. Despite their ambitious goals, they didn't typically fare well at marine and jungle warfare, the exact type of environment of the majority of Southeast Asia. The Mongols' many attempts at conquering the region ended in repeated failure. One such example was Kublai Khan's invasion of the island of Java in modern-day Indonesia. The vast majority of the Mongol sailors were ethnically Chinese, mostly from Fujian province. With the Mongols' motherland being landlocked, they possessed little to no indigenous naval technologies, so the entire Mongol fleet consisted of Chinese and Korean-style military vessels and weaponry. It's widely believed that in contrast to the Mongols' adept capabilities on land, which allowed them to successfully absorb and lead conquered armies, their lack of prowess on the high seas and their reliance on the expertise of foreign navies allowed many Chinese and Korean sailors to intentionally sabotage Mongol naval campaigns.
Maybe I'd just check in this barrel here.
How'd that get in there?
While the invasion of Java ended in catastrophe, with an estimated 60% of a 30,000-strong naval force killed or missing in action, the invasion left a lasting impact on the region. It introduced gunpowder to Southeast Asia, along with Chinese shipbuilding techniques, which were absorbed by Javanese shipbuilders. A new type of jong appeared during this era, called the Sino-Southeast Asian hybrid jong, that mixed Chinese techniques in their manufacture, namely the usage of iron nails alongside wooden dowels. The Mongols also brought back with them to China detailed maps of the interiors of many islands, bringing to light the landscape, demographics, and cultures of much of Southeast Asia. Modern-day Malaysia was also heavily influenced by the Khan's military campaigns. Borneo became a staging ground to launch attacks into Java. Many Chinese troops would remain or return to the Malay region following the war, and were generally welcomed by the local indigenous populations who were eager to trade for Chinese goods, particularly jars, beads, silk, and pottery. However, perhaps more important than the Mongols' failed attempts at conquering Southeast Asia was their successful conquest of the Eurasia mainland, which strengthened the paths of the Silk Road, and as a result, allowed goods from every corner of the Mongol Empire and beyond to become accessible in and out of the maritime Silk Road of Southeast Asia like never before. Considered one of the zeniths of Chinese dominance over East Asia, the Ming dynasty would overthrow the Yuan dynasty and capitalize on these newly flourishing maritime trade routes laid out by their Mongol predecessors. We've now come full circle back to Zheng He and his treasure voyages. After Zheng's maritime campaigns, the number of Chinese migrants venturing into Southeast Asia increased exponentially. Significant numbers of permanent Chinese settlements began sprouting in various coastal cities. One such notable example is Manila, which has had evidence of a Chinese presence since as early as the 10th century. By the time the Spanish arrived in 1571 AD, a settlement with a population of roughly 2,000 Chinese merchants, artisans, and laborers had already long called the city home. These Chinese were integral to the local economy, dominating trade, retail, and artisanal industries, and would become locally known as Senglis. They initially served as intermediaries between the Spanish colonizers and the local Filipino population. As the Spanish officially colonized the archipelago, they brought with them access to goods and silver from every corner of their vast and growing global empire, drawing in even greater numbers of Chinese to emigrate to Manila. By the early 17th century, the number of Senglis in Manila numbered upwards of 30,000.
During the early stages of Spanish colonization of the Philippines, the Spanish utilized the Chinese as intermediaries to conduct business indirectly with the indigenous populations. But over time, tensions would mount between the Spanish and the Chinese over control over the region, often boiling over to the point of military conflict. The most notable was in 1603, when 20,000 Chinese were massacred during the Sangli Rebellion. With a significant number of Chinese merchants killed or displaced, the local economy quickly collapsed, and the Spanish, realizing the important role the Chinese played in generating wealth in the region, wrote letters to Qing officials in Fujian province explaining the reason for the conflict, and offered favorable trade terms and lodging to new Chinese merchants that would replace the massacred population.
Over the centuries, Chinese migrants would marry into local families, creating a unique Chinese-Filipino culture. Chinese festivals like the Lunar New Year are widely celebrated, and Chinese cuisine has heavily influenced Filipino food. Today, despite many Filipinos claiming Spanish heritage due to the prevalence of Hispanic surnames throughout the nation, the actual percentage of Filipinos with Spanish heritage is somewhere in the range of 1 to 3%, which is dwarfed by the 18 to 27% of the population that can trace their ancestry back to China, underscoring the significant presence and influence Chinese migrants had on the archipelago long before European influence.
You know what the difference between Chinese and Filipino tour races is? The difference between a Honda Civic and a tinted Honda Civic. One's a little darker but more stylish, that's it!
While Zheng He's campaigns into Southeast Asia did not formally conquer or annex any kingdoms outside of northern Vietnam into the Ming Empire, they immeasurably influenced the trajectory of Southeast Asian history. For example, Malacca, which consisted of lands formerly under the control of the Kingdom of Siam, was founded and gained independence after convoys from the Ming Dynasty developed a city and crowned a local Muslim chief king. Malacca and Brunei were notable Islamified regions that developed favorable relations with Ming forces and Chinese colonists. After pledging protection to the Chinese, Muslim sultanates grew eager to join houses with high-ranking Chinese diplomats, marrying many of their daughters to Chinese envoys, converting many, which facilitated the spread of Islam throughout Southeast Asia and even back to Fujian and Canton provinces, where Islam flourished for generations. Like the Philippines, the Malay archipelago possessed a strong Chinese presence in the region for centuries prior to European colonization. However, with the arrival of the Portuguese, followed by the Dutch, and finally followed by the British, millions of Chinese, mostly from Canton and Fujian, would flock to Malaysia to trade and seek work opportunities created by the Europeans. Singapore, sitting at the tip of the Malay Peninsula, was perhaps the most exaggerated case. Fleeing war and famine in China, many Chinese arrived to Singapore to fill labor positions, largely on pepper and Gambier plantations.
Welcome to Singapore.
By 1860 AD, 40,000 Chinese called Singapore home, making up roughly half of the British colony's population. By the 20th century, 3 out of every 4 people living in Singapore was of Chinese descent, an unprecedented statistic for a Southeast Asian nation. Today, the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia is somewhat of a touchy subject. While their numbers are significant, with Singapore being the only exception, Chinese are by far the minority ethnic group in every country throughout Southeast Asia. But like throughout pre-modern history, they are overrepresented in playing important roles in local economies and politics. In the Philippines, for example, people who identify as full Chinese constitute 1% of the total population, yet control as much as 60% of the private economy. In Indonesia, we see something similar, with the Chinese making up 5% of the population, but control around 70% of the private economy. And this is not even mentioning the number of ethnically mixed Chinese who have more or less integrated with local populations, who also tend to dominate nearly all levels and sectors of business and politics. Because of this socio-economic disparity between the Chinese and the indigenous populations of Southeast Asia, strong anti-Chinese sentiments have developed throughout the centuries. Race riots and Chinese exclusion policies have been repeating themes. One of the more severe examples was the May 13th incident in 1969 that took place in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, where over 600 people, mostly of Chinese descent, were killed. Some historians suggest that the actual number may be far greater. And in the 21st century, tensions continue to rise as the People's Republic of China has grown into the superpower of Asia, asserting its dominance over the continent, not so much through military force as China once did in the past, but through political and economic strategies. Territory disputes, Chinese foreign investment, and Chinese migration into Southeast Asia continue to be points of contention. With Southeast Asian economies becoming some of the fastest growing in the world today, it's no wonder that the Chinese have sought opportunities in the region for millennia. Now the question is, what does the distant future of the Chinese presence in Southeast Asia look like? Will they eventually fully integrate with the local populations? Will new blends of hybrid Chinese indigenous cultures blossom? Or will the Chinese preserve their own culture and remain a distinct minority ethnic group in each respective country? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you'd like to learn more about how China reached the edge of Southeast Asia and conquered all of what is now southern China, you should check out my video on Baiyue, the Cantonese tribes before they were Chinese.